Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker, Casey, and before we start, I just need to say a quick apology. As some of you will know, I have been working very hard on securing advertising and sponsorship for the show so that I can keep releasing weekly content. I do pride myself on my due diligence, with who promotes on the show, the guests we have on here, and even the programmatic ads that are automatically inserted by my podcast host. However, last week I did briefly have an ad on the show for a company that seems to have a hidden agenda that I do not support or align with. I won't go into too much detail on the show, but thank you so much for the listeners that got in touch to let me know about this. I did not realise the symbolism used was questionable. I'm not familiar with that particular group, nor do I frequent those parts of the internet, but I have researched now, so thank you. If you would like to know more about this situation, I would like to remain open about it, and I'm happy to have a discussion and answer any questions. I just don't want it to take up too much time on the show. But now on to happier news. Thank you so much to last week's guest, who is now a patron. Miriam, thank you for your support. I am so excited to have you here on the show on so many different levels, and I really hope you enjoy going back through the exclusive content, and I hope you enjoy the merchandise which is now on its way to you in the post. Today we are looking at how branches of sects and religious groups are formed by people who interpret faith-based texts their own way, and then leave their congregation to start a brand new movement. This could be happening in your backyard. Here is Elijah. Hi, Elijah, and thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. I'm looking forward to chatting with you and hearing your story on this subject, which is new territory for me and the show.
Okay.
So would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. My name's Elijah. I'm from Houston, Texas. And yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm a little nervous.
And you were just saying then before we hit the record button that you've got a storm moving through?
Yes, the tropical storm. The name escapes me at the moment, but yeah, it's blowing through right now. So hopefully it doesn't affect anything.
Oh my goodness. Have they given any predictions on sort of how devastating it's supposed to be?
It's just flash flood warnings. It's pretty typical. Like Houstonians are kind of used to like flash flood warnings. So
that is so alien to me, because if we had a flash flood over here where I am, it would be like nothing that had ever happened over here before. And Americans are so casual about, and I'm sure obviously it's not just America. I'm sure there's people listening in Canada with the snow, and Australia with their weather as well. Russia has some really diverse weather from one end of the country to the other, but it's so interesting when I speak to my friends over in America and they're like, oh yeah, we had a hurricane. And I'm like, that is wild. That's not like something really blasé. You're like, oh, well, our houses are built for it. We had the generators ready. That to me is just not something that I'm used to at all. So I hope that it passes through without causing any damage.
Yeah. We Houstonians, we kind of pull together when stuff gets really bad, like in Harvey, we all helped each other out. And so
yeah, there was some really intense snowstorms a few months ago, if I remember rightly.
For sure. Yes.
And that was quite strange for that part of the world.
It definitely was. I had never seen snow like that before in my life.
Wow. I think I remember reading some really tragic stories about a lot of people in mobility homes that froze.
Yes.
Because of the weather. So it's strange. We're definitely getting weather over here that's not typical for England. It is changing. And then there's that huge debate and can of worms around global warming, but that's probably a discussion for another time.
Right.
So you grew up in a new apostolic movement. Is that right?
So the story is a little more like you mentioned earlier how you talk about like you first got into like Jim Jones and stuff like that. My cult experience definitely was more catered around a cult of personality.
Okay.
But the church I grew up in actually was kind of related to that, but the church I grew up in, where we actually met the guy who started the cult, was like a Foursquare denomination. And the particular church that I went to followed the Toronto, what they call the Toronto Blessing, which was like a charismatic revival that happened in Canada, which involves like speaking in tongues and laughing and rolling on the ground and what they call being drunk on the Holy Spirit. So my church upbringing was kind of bizarre. It was a pretty big church, and there was a lot of people there. But how I got into the cult was there was a man, I guess I can just call him by his first name, Richard. He was attending that church at the same time, and he wanted to like start like a youth TV show, like ministry on public access. So he actually started it with one of my other friends, Christian, who went to the same church, and he invited me to be on the TV show as well. And actually, some of the TV show is still on YouTube, uploaded to YouTube. But it started as that, and then it progressed. It progressed until Richard was like, God's calling me to start a church. So we left our main church into like a warehouse building. And then when I graduated, Richard convinced my mother that basically not to send me to college, but to send him to like the youth program, because he had a habit of categorizing every young guy he met as like troubled youth. And so, yeah, like we started as like a ragtag group under Richard.
Okay, interesting. So you grew up in this Foursquare denomination?
Yes.
With your parents?
My mother mostly. My father never attended. He was Catholic at the time.
Okay, so your mum is practicing her faith and your dad is practicing his faith.
Yes.
Would you say that your mum was more devout in her faith than your father was?
For sure. Like there was always contention in the household. Like my father liked watching crazy movies, and my mother was very against it. And we weren't allowed, like I don't know if you know about like the 90s, like the Christian 90s movement where like they said Pokemon was the devil and like that kind of stuff. Yeah, my mom was very much that mom. Like we weren't allowed to have Pokemon games or Pokemon cards.
Right. Was there ever a case where any of that stuff was found in the house?
Yeah, there was. I don't really remember a particular moment, but it was basically like you're not. It wasn't like anything like over the top. Like we weren't punished or anything. But my mom just was very wary of that kind of stuff.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. And so when you say we, I'm guessing that you're not an only child.
Right. I'm sorry. Yes, I have a younger brother and 3 older sisters.
Oh, okay. So a pretty even household then, really.
Yeah, pretty big.
So your mum would then take you and your siblings to church services that were around what she practiced with her faith.
Right.
Okay. And what did that look like in terms of commitment to services? Were they once a week or a few times a week?
So that particular church environment was pretty standard. It was just, they had Friday nights, which were kind of like this weird, relaxed worship where people would come together and they'd play music and people would chill in the dark and just quote unquote, like soak in the Holy Spirit. Like, it was like what's a good way to describe it? Like prayer and like meditation and just like, for whatever reason, I guess people in that church had a habit of just like making weird noises. So it was just a weird, dark room with weird noises going on and prayer, and it was kind of a scary thing to grow up in. Like
it sounds like it, especially if I was going to say I was looking for a building and I walked into the wrong room, and this is what I what I walked into. For somebody coming in from the outside, I'm sure it looked very bizarre.
It really was. Like, I grew up in this, so I didn't really know how bizarre it was until we brought a friend along, and they were like, "Man, that you guys are crazy." And I was like, "Well, I didn't really like. I was very much of a kid of like, if I didn't feel it, I didn't force it." Because like they would have like prayer to where like they would lay hands and then people would fall under, but I never made myself fall because I wanted to feel something, but I never felt anything. And there were a few times when I was actually pushed, but yeah, that I don't think all four square churches are like that. I'm not sure if it's just this particular one in Houston because they had ties with Toronto.
Yeah, and
the charismatic movement.
You've got the Bible Belt as well across those parts of America, and I'm sure listeners will know what I'm about to say. We've talked a lot about this type of spirituality in Pentecostalism in terms of casting out demons and speaking in tongues and being drunk on the Holy Spirit. And that to me paints an image in my head of these public access types of shows where people are rolling around on the floor and throwing their arms up in the air and kind of flailing around and speaking all kind of strange gibberish. And I'm not sure if that was your specific experience, but when people say things like speaking in tongues or drunk on the Holy Spirit, that is what comes to my mind. Those televangelist types of TV shows that often pop up.
It was very much like that. They even had like flag girls where like girls would worship in the back waving flags and like dancing with tambourines. Yeah, I mean, it was like that, like you said, but it was more like a bunch of weird. I've never been to another charismatic church particularly just like that, but yeah, I would say it is for sure like how you're describing.
Right. Yeah. And music plays a big part in these movements as well, in terms of getting people into a state of mind where they will behave in a way or believe in a way or join in a particular way. It seems as if music almost changes. Well, it does change the environment and invites these types of situations to play out. And music is a very powerful thing, and it's used in all of these movements and these groups. So when you say that there were girls in the back with the flags and the tambourines, I'm sure that there was other music as well that contributed to this environment.
Yeah, like they had a generic worship team up front that would play like kind of like slow, like reverb heavy music. You know, yeah. Going to that church, it was definitely bizarre, but it was more so the people, not so much like the leadership of that church, but the people that would hang around that church were, I would say, problematic.
So in the area that you lived in, this wasn't the main like branch of Christianity that was practiced?
You know, I honestly haven't been to like too many other charismatic churches in the area, but from what I understand, like from talking with friends, that particular church I grew up in was kind of bizarre.
So this person that you are attending church with, who branches off to create his own group, is taking these maybe more fringe practices and beliefs and applying them to his own group when he goes off to find it.
Yeah. So Richard, the guy who started the other church, he started off working at the coffee shop at the church. Like they had a coffee shop that they had.
Okay.
And he actually used to work in the music industry, like in the early 2000s. He actually worked He was a sound engineer for Destiny's Child and Creed.
Wow.
He would tour with Creed mostly and work with Destiny's Child.
Two very different bands.
Yeah, they were signed to the same record label, I think, at the time. Yeah, but he definitely used that as like to build up a reputation,
right.
Especially with the younger teenagers. Like, oh, I used to hang out with Creed.
Yeah, that's interesting in itself, because when you think of Christianity and modesty, Destiny's Child and the image that they have is not the first thing that pops into your mind, I imagine. So right. It's interesting that he would use his experiences with these various bands as a way to kind of build up a following.
And the thing about it, it's like it was kind of hard to discern that he wasn't necessarily right in the head, because he had like these connections. Like, he showed me early on, a picture of Eminem that he took, because he used to like do stuff with Eminem.
Right.
And it was like a personal photo, like it was a physical photo.
Wow.
And I was like, man, like this guy, and he would tell us like, yeah, God called me away. God called me away from like the secular music industry to come work like in God's kingdom. Like that's how he would spin the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I actually found out I had a friend, the same friend, Christian, who told me essentially that he lied about the whole thing, that he actually got fired from that studio. Like, he didn't leave voluntarily, but he was telling everybody, like God called him like to leave, because he would attend Lakewood Church in Houston, and he started going to like the ministry school in Lakewood.
Okay.
Which is like a really big church in Houston.
Okay. So he's trying to spin his lack of employment as divine intervention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
that is yeah, I suppose that's one way to do it. So do you know roughly what age Richard was when he left your church to create his own group?
He was like 32.
Right. Okay. So 32, he goes off to work in the music industry.
Well, no. I'm sorry. He didn't branch off to start his own church until like my family got involved with him, like with the TV show.
Okay.
Like, I would say the timeline for him would be like the early 2000s. He was working in the music industry, so he was in his 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And then around 2007 is when he lost his job, lost his high rise in downtown and stuff, and then moved in with his brother and started going to Lakewood. And then from there, he joined the ministry school at Lakewood, and then went to a school called School of the Prophets here in Houston somewhere. I've never heard of it, but he had like certificates. And then from there, he started going to the church. He started attending the church that I grew up at. And that's where we met him. We met him at this church that my mom went to.
Right. Okay. So it's almost like if you were to try and have credentials in starting a group, he seems to have attended the places that would give you those, if that makes sense. You said you mentioned seeing certificates and stuff, so it's like learning how to preach, learning how to lead, those types of things.
Well, he himself is a very charismatic person. Like,
okay,
he's very, like, it's hard not to get caught up in a conversation with him. Like, he's very charismatic. Like, I mean, I'm sure you hear this about every cult leader that eventually like gets found out, like, but they're very charismatic and convincing and manipulative.
Mm-hmm. But they're still charismatic and manipulative in their own ways. They're all still very unique to one another, even if the methods that are used are the same or very similar. So if you listen to L. Ron Hubbard, he'll sound very different to somebody like Keith Raniere from Nexium. And I'm sure that the same could be said about this Richard guy, very charismatic in his own way. So he branches off to create this own kids TV show.
Yes.
Okay.
We were still going to the church I grew up at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was still in high school, so we would only see him like every other weekend.
Right.
And meet up with him sometimes at Denny's, because I was like his favorite spot was like Denny's and IHOP. Like these diner restaurants.
So how old on average is the group that he's working with? So you're in high school, he's around 32.
Yes. So yeah, we were
so
like
you're
17, 18.
Teenagers. Yeah. Okay. I'm just trying to kind of work out to me, somebody of that age who wants to surround themselves by somebody or groups of people aged 17 to 18 is looking potentially for a more vulnerable community group or a more susceptible community group that they might be able to impose their ideas on.
Well, absolutely. Like that was almost in a weird way his pitch, because, his pitch was like God, he would say like, God has called me to call the children back to the Father. So he would say stuff like, God's calling me to minister to youth, particularly young men who are troubled. And because like he would say like I was a troubled youth, like he would say he was a drug addict, like he was promiscuous with both sexes. He was basically, his like pitch was, I was deep in the world as far as you can go, but then God called me out of it. Like it was like this major transformation, like, oh, like if God can change me, he can change any of you, basically. But yeah, so like he would target young boys, essentially, like teenagers, 15, 12 sometimes. Like we would have like 12-year-olds sometimes come to the group. He actually got, maybe I'm jumping a little too ahead, but a couple of years after the TV show, he actually got like a certificate for the Texas, what is it? There's like a program for like criminal youth, like under 18. He actually got a credential for them to like send kids to get reformed through that program to like our group.
Right. Okay. So we've talked a lot on the show about these therapeutic centers, rehabilitation centers, and therapeutic schools or reform schools that a lot of young adults are sent to, that kind of falls under this label called the troubled teen industry.
Yes.
And those therapeutic boarding schools were often in themselves extremely abusive, and used cult-like methods of control. So at some point he goes ahead and gets certification to work with or to send participants to one of these types of centers.
Yeah. So like, I'm actually in that Google Drive I sent you, there's a video in there called Recovery Camp 2. Some of those kids were from that program.
Right.
In that
he would have participants from these programs come to his group, or he would send participants of his group to these programs.
Well, he became like a Houston deacon, like I don't know what they're called, like a Houston like deacon, and then he got the Texas, the word is, I used to know it off the top of my head, but it's slipping me. It's like the Texas like juvenile thing.
Okay.
We only got like a handful of kids from there. It wasn't like a big operation, but I would say like our group was a weird ragtag of like a charismatic church and also like a recovery facility.
Okay.
Yeah, we were trying to be, or he was trying to make it so many different things, and they made it really unsuccessful, which actually caused a lot of the contention and problems within the cult, because he would often get really mad and like go on these like tyrannical like rants about how we were going to hell and we were holding them back from God's will. It was it was pretty rough.
Yeah, it sounds erratic at best, but
yeah, for sure.
But let's jump back a little bit to
sure.
So he decides he's going to leave the group that you attend with your mother, and he's going to get this warehouse. You said he's got like a warehouse space.
Yeah, so essentially he moved out of his brother's rental property and into like it's like a business park, but more it's like a business park more catered towards like mechanic shops, like
Okay.
businesses that don't require like a straight up storefront, mostly
Yeah,
like
yeah.
manufacturing, small scale manufacturing businesses like car companies, or maybe like a small company that's doing a startup. But we actually rented one, and we converted the warehouse portion into the church, and we lived in the office spaces.
Wow. Okay. So hang on, let me just jump back a second. So you are 17, 18.
Yeah, when I
This
graduated I was 19.
so this Richard has started this group. Him and Christian, did you say, convinced your mum to let you attend his group instead of going off to university?
Yeah, and actually my brother, my sister Diana got pulled into the group as well. So my mother and my sister, my brother were deeply involved. My younger brother also was living with us there. And
Wow.
eventually my sister Diana actually married Richard at one point.
Whoa. Okay. All right. So, how does he pitch this to your family to kind of get your mum on board to convince your family not to attend further education? What is his pitch?
So basically that he basically said that God had a calling on my life to become like a prophet, like a major prophet of this like time period, essentially. And it was he was instructing God to like God was instructing him to mentor me into like this calling. So
And that was the same for your entire family. That was the premise for your whole family.
well, like my family came along as like as a means to like, I guess, help, like be like helpers in the ministry. Like my mother, I don't remember what kind of calling he would say they had, but they were basically like helpers, like helping organize the money and doing like fundraisers and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that.
I am so fascinated by this story so far. There's so many things that I like want to ask you, and things that like I feel like there needs to be so much
There's a
more
lot.
information on. So I'm at the moment in my mind, I'm just trying to build a timeline. But you keep throwing these little things in there, like, and then he married my sister. So
Yeah. I'm so sorry.
no, please
Honestly,
don't
like
apologize.
you can break this thing up into sagas. Like they're like that's how like it was a long. I mean, definitely not as long for other people, but for me, it was like 8 years out of my life. Like there was like
Oh wow.
sagas to it. Like I would say the beginning was definitely like the love bomb phase with the TV shows,
Mm.
and then it started. Honestly, it started going downhill when we moved into our first building. um,
So
uh, sorry, it's just so
you
much.
please, I'm sure this is something that comes from being involved in this group for like 8 years, but please
Yeah,
stop apologizing, because there's nothing to apologize for.
yeah,
It's, if anything, it just makes the conversation more interesting and keeps us on our
yeah,
toes, because we just don't know what's going to come next.
right.
So you're 17, 18 when you get involved with this branch that Richard has set up. Does he have a name for this group?
So we started off as like lead by faith, and then like we called ourselves like Elijah Fire Church. But we would follow the he would read a lot of books from these churches called like a church called Bethel in California, and the IHOP Church in is it Oklahoma, and then there's the Morning Star Church on the East Coast. I'm not sure which state, but they all kind of like form the main three of like the new apostolic movement, or the new like or I would say they're more popular churches in that movement. But we would read books like from like teachers from those churches,
Right.
and
Okay.
that's how we got into the Seven Mountains Dominionism and or a new apostolic movement. Sorry, it's kind of like
Yeah,
vague.
it's no, and I think that almost it keeps it in line with how you've described Richard so far. Quite erratic, a little bit of everything, not really
Right.
sure which direction he wants to go in, but he wants a lot of things included in his overall sort of practices and beliefs, and the direction that he wants to take the group in is sort of
it was very like, he was very disorganized, but he would project onto others like we were the ones actually causing the problems.
And you graduate at 19, you don't go into further education, you join some of your family members in the warehouse, you move in. Does your mum move into the warehouse, or does she live at home and commute to the warehouse?
So man, I really do have to start from the beginning. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So let me just try to spit out as much as I can about like the beginning of it. So I guess a little backstory on how I got pulled in, like how I was convinced of it was, I didn't have, my upbringing was very like chaotic and traumatic. Not necessarily due to my parents, but the circumstance of we all lived in the beginning, we kind of lived in like a big house with like different family members on my dad's side. And just to sum it up, like they were abusive. So that, and then also I had a lot of problems in school. Like I had learning problems in school, and I had a lot of teachers that were mean to me. So like it kind of, I actually escalated to like a school board meeting with one of my parents. It got so bad. But I just was not a confident kid. I was very withdrawn. I was very introverted, not confident in myself at all. And then I think that kind of what drew Richard to me. But anyways, from there, like I had started, like honestly, like in high school, I was practicing trying to be homeless on my patio because I thought I wasn't gonna like graduate high school. Like I just was not confident in myself at all. And then one day at church, like this guy comes up to me and starts talking to me, and like I never had an adult talk to me in that capacity before.
Yeah.
Like he would look me in the eye, he would actually listen to stories I would tell him. And it kind of like drew me to him, like, man, this guy really cares, and I decided to actually, the funny thing is I actually went to like a church camp before I met him.
Yeah.
And decided to like take my faith seriously. And not long after that is when I met Richard. So in my mind, I thought like God was bringing Richard into my life to like mentor me. And I'm sure it's just because I started going to church more and then he saw me at church. But like he basically said that like I was his spiritual son. Like that was a common theme with him was, these kids were his spiritual sons. And he would tell other adults in the church this too. And because of like how the denomination was, no one batted an eye. Like, oh yeah, spiritual sons and daughters, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But so we start this TV show, and it's on and off for a while, and then we stopped doing the youth one, and we do like a regular ministry TV show. We do that for like a year and a half, and then when it gets close to me graduating, Richard calls us up one night and like, God gave me a vision that we're supposed to start our own ministry. So we all left. We stopped attending like the church I grew up at, and then moved into this warehouse building. But a little bit before that, I would say the summer before that, Richard had been hanging out with my sister a lot more often because she had already graduated and she was going through a divorce. And so they got really close. And then decided to get married. So that was, I would say like my sister was attracted to the idea of like being married to like a man of God, like a minister, someone called to a higher call. And a little bit before that, I would say a year before we left, Richard convinced my mother to separate from my dad, so we actually moved.
Wow. Okay.
We moved from West Houston up to like Northeast Houston in an area called Humble, Texas. So we actually lived away from my father for like the last year of me in school. So that's how like Richard was able to sink his claws into my family mostly, as he was able to separate us from my father.
So he maybe senses your vulnerability as somebody
Yes.
who's not very confident in themselves, has not had the best relationships or role models in terms of adults, and the relationships that you formed with teachers and your kind of parents not having their own, they're not on the same page with things like what they believe in and that sort of thing. And right. So he's got you there, and then he's married your sister, which means he has significant influence, I'm sure, over her at this point. And yes. Then because he has those relationships with you and your sister, he's then able to establish some type of relationship with your mum that allows him to have significant influence on your family overall.
Yeah. Well, my mother had already had problems with my dad.
Okay.
But it was more religious than anything. And I would say like my dad really did try to get us away from it, but Richard had already like put ideas in our head that he was possessed, because my father actually has like some mental health issues.
Right. Oh no. And that was used as a...
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Oh.
And yeah, like he really did try, and you know, I wouldn't put any blame on him, because he tried to his best capacity, you know, in his mind.
Yeah.
To try to convince us, but it just...
Right.
Richard was too cunning.
Oh, that must have been really difficult for your father as well, to have his family kind of move away after he tried to convince you to not move away. So you're working on this youth TV show. How is this done? Because I know public access TV is different to terrestrial TV. Sort of anybody, in my mind anyway, I'm not sure if this is right. You might have to kind of talk me through it, but anybody sure. can upload stuff to public access TV. Is that right? Or more people than the like mainstream channels?
Right. So essentially, what you have to do is we actually went through a place called Houston Media Source.
Okay.
And they were like an education institution / public access. Like they were like both. But you would have to, essentially what you do is you would join the producer program. You'd pay like a yearly fee of $300 for like producer fees.
Right.
And that gave you access to the studio and or like submitting tapes to be like aired. So you could do a live show, like you can schedule like a date to do a live show, or you could submit a tape to be aired in any particular time slot. So Richard became buddies with the guy, like the manager there, and he was able to secure us like a weekly. It was weekly at one point, then became like bi-weekly, but like a weekly time slot where we would live stream or like broadcast live from the studio.
And the studio was in the warehouse.
Well, the studio was actually at Houston Media Source headquarters.
Oh, okay. And so they had a team that could do the filming and that sort of thing, because my next question was going to be who had the experience to handle the recording equipment and all of that sort of thing.
So Richard had already had experience with like video editing and shooting video from like the music industry. So he actually trained me and a few other kids from high school. Actually, like he actually went to Spring High School and got like a little program to where they sent kids from Spring High School to come help, like that were in the media, like that were in the media department.
Yeah.
And to come help. And like that was another way he was trying to like lure young kids into the ministry, was like, oh, we're going to teach you how to broadcast, but then preach Jesus to you on the side.
Yeah.
So we did that for a while, and then when we graduated and moved into the building, we actually stopped broadcasting live and started filming little shows in the church and then submitting the tapes.
Okay.
But then that stopped.
What types of
not long
things
after.
were you? What were there? Were they pre-scripted? Was it kind of ad lib? Like, how did that work? What was the show about?
So Richard would have like, it was both basically about end time prophecy and like prophetic stuff. Like he would have guests on, like talk about like the visions they had from God.
Okay.
And like sometimes it'd just be him, other times it'd be like people within like the Houston like spiritual like circuit, I guess.
Okay.
Come on and like give like their prophecies they had from God or whatever.
And when you said that Richard had a vision where you were all supposed to kind of live in the warehouse with him,
Right.
your brother, your sister, and your mum, and yourself.
Right.
You must then have thought at that point that he had a connection to God and was godly himself.
Oh yeah, like he would talk to us all about, he would talk to us all the time about how like he had a dream last night that God showed him an earthquake was going to hit. We should all start praying. Or he would tell us like he saw heaven opening up and Jesus gave him like a particular Bible verse, so he'd be asphyxiated on that Bible verse for like a few months.
Okay.
And then I honestly think he is like a mentally ill in the sense of like experiencing religious psychosis, but he also is very narcissistic. But anyways, yeah, he would go into like these almost like trance like states to where like he would be speaking in tongues and just being really weird. And then
okay.
Yeah.
And so you move into the warehouse. How many of you live there, and what are the sleeping arrangements like?
Okay, so I actually have pictures. Actually have pictures of us when we first moved in, but when we first moved in, we just had mattresses in the warehouse that we would sleep on, like on the ground, until we built out the church. And then we moved into the back room. And at that point, it was me, a guy I'm gonna call Paul. So it was me, Paul, my brother, my sister, and Richard, all living in this one back room. There was a bed. There was two beds, one bunk bed and one regular bed. And we were all kind of crammed into this room.
Wow. Okay.
And at this point, my brother was still in high school, so he was living with mom down the road.
Okay.
And we would hold church services
in the warehouse, right?
Yeah.
And how many people were there roughly in the congregation at this point?
No, not a lot of people. It was really just us.
Okay.
We would have some people that knew us from the other church come by here and there, but this is where like it got kind of a major issue for Richard, because Richard was like, God showed me that we were going to start a church and he was going to bring a lot of people to the church, but when it wasn't happening, he started blaming us for it, like, oh, you guys must be sinning, or you guys are not praying enough, or you're not praying, like speaking in tongues enough. You guys aren't doing this enough. Like you guys are driving like people away, essentially.
Right,
like he would,
right.
But really it's just this weird warehouse, like weird building that we all obviously lived in.
It's nothing to do with Richard and the warehouse and like a group of you kind of living in the back room that's causing people to maybe not want to come in at all, or when they do come in, to stick around.
Yeah. And what we would do is, since we had cameras from like previous media stuff, we would usually record services. So somewhere in another, like, there's this guy named Brian who still like is very much associated with Richard. He has like a garage full of like DV tapes and CDs of all these like sermons that no one attended.
Wow. Okay. So was there ever a point where things did pick up and there was more of a following?
That was a couple of years later. So essentially, Richard was like, I feel like God's calling us to move buildings. So when our lease went up, we actually moved. We were like kind of on the outskirts of Humboldt, and then we actually moved to a business park that was in downtown Humble. And I would say it kind of picked up a little bit. Like we've had like different families and their kids come, but it was here and there. It wasn't really, it never actually exceeded like 10 people.
Right. Okay. So when we talk about this group, it's becoming more of one of those situations where it's like almost like a family cult, where there's a small amount of people involved, but the methods being used are still those that are similar to larger groups, which probably makes it more difficult for each participant, because there could be a lot more intense focus on you as an individual, because the group is that small that everything you're doing could be monitored.
Right.
And you're kind of such a small group that you'll notice if somebody wasn't there for a service, or if somebody decided to kind of go and do something else for a day.
Yeah, there was nothing like that. Like we were all monitored like 24/7. Like, and I would say like when we moved into Humble, we had like a building that was towards the front, but after a year we moved into like a second bigger building within the same business park, and that's when it actually became the biggest had been. When he decided to kind of steer away from like focusing so much on the church, but like starting what he called the program, like that's what it was called. And the program is when he was able to get like a couple of kids in from that Texas program.
Yeah.
And it became more of like that's when I would say the cult reached its heights in terms of like what you would imagine a cult looks like, because we had like 8 of us, 10 of us, like teenagers to early 20s, all cramped in the back room. And like we would like, Richard would keep us up to like 2 a.m., like building out the church, or he would randomly wake us up to like teach us a sermon, or we'd go on these long drives to random spots that he'd said like where spiritual warfare was happening. And we'd all have to sit there and pray in the middle of the night, like a random lot of land. Actually, at one point, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Jesus Camp. Have you seen that?
I haven't seen that film, no.
It was a pretty significant film in the early 2000s, but Richard actually got in contact with the kid that was the star of that documentary, and he actually came down to do like a youth camp. So we had him come down, and we did like we all went to Galveston, which is like a city south of Houston, like on an island. It's like a beach. But anyways, we did like a documentary with him that I actually was in charge of filming and editing. But yeah, just so much. I'm so sorry. I'm all over the place.
No, it's all really interesting, and the fact that you're filming and editing, and it's like you have your own role and responsibility within this group, which probably is affirming your beliefs in Richard and his vision and the overall kind of journey that this group is going on, I imagine.
I mean, that's how I was able to like smuggle out video and pictures, was because I was in charge of like helping out with the media and editing. And
I've just Googled here Texas therapeutic boarding schools, and there's so many. There's New Leaf Academy Boarding School for Girls in Bend, Oregon, Teen Residential Treatment Center, Shrub Oak International School. Behavioral boarding schools in the area include Thrive Girls Ranch, New Hope Boys Home. They all just sound absolutely terrifying. I don't want to go to any of them. And we were
definitely less organized than those. It was a sight to behold, to be honest, because we had a hard time paying the bills. So a lot of the times I was working I had a job at Starbucks. I would basically give my entire check to Richard, but at the same time, when I'd get off, we would go and sell water bottles on the side of the road for like 8 hours a day. We would hold out signs that say like help troubled youth, like church ministry, like youth ministry. But in reality, we were just like this group of kids living in a warehouse. We weren't like an actual church group, like a youth group.
The thing is, you've got these different control methods coming in now. You've got the sleep deprivation.
Oh yes.
It's probably when Richard is pacing around and can't shut off his own brain, he's waking everybody up and then subjecting all of you to his ramblings of whatever it is that he wants to talk about for 5 hours at a time. And then he's kind of that. Then you're going out and spending all your free time on trying to. Well, not only are you giving your wages to money was I was going to ask how the whole project was funded, but not only are you giving your wages over to Richard to make sure that the group remains funded in some way for rent and food and whatever else, you're also then spending your free time going out to make more money for the church.
Right.
And does that leave you with any leisure time at all? Do you have any hobbies or anything at this point outside of the church, or friends outside of the church?
No, so we were basically like in the program, quote unquote, which meant like we couldn't have outside friends, we couldn't date. We didn't have cell phones with internet connectivity. We basically lived in the church, and we would read the Bible. Like we would have like designated Bible reading times and like studies. We would have to like write essays, and we would get we have to turn in our essays at the end of the day to ensure that we were reading the Bible. And we would have this thing on Tuesdays called the chair. And so essentially like once a week, we all got together and ratted each other out if we were like sinning or falling asleep during prayer, or
right. Okay.
If someone was rude, we would kind of like berate each other. And,
okay. And just as a side question, did this start to happen once young adults were coming through from this program in Texas?
Yes.
Because those are exactly the types of techniques that are used in these horrible therapeutic boarding schools. So it's interesting that started to happen after Richard had acquainted himself with one small part of the troubled teen industry.
Right.
It's like there's a self-policing system that's created where you're all too worried about each other and keeping an eye on one another, and too worried about what you're doing in case anyone else is watching you, that you're not really thinking about what Richard is saying, what Richard is doing, what Richard is asking of everybody, because you're looking across at your sister who's watched you maybe use a swear word or come home from selling water bottles 3 hours earlier than you were supposed to, and things like that. It means that you're more worried about each other than the guy in charge.
Right.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
I was gonna say like it was definitely an experience. Like it was like those schools you said, but there was another element because Richard was he lived in the building too, and he had his office that he would stay in, but he also had like security cameras rigged up, so like we were like recorded like 24/7. But like when the chairs first started, like when Tuesdays first started, they were more like not uplifting, but they were more positive. Like, all right, like you know better now. But as it progressed, like especially if we got like in trouble for the same thing, like Richard would get more erratic. And at one point, there was a guy, I forgot to mention this. There's a guy named Brian, who I'll call him Brian, who was around Richard's age, who was like, quote unquote, the pastor.
Okay.
That he actually met this guy at another group that he used to go to before this. But this guy was like a special operations officer for HPD. But he was a part of like the leadership team. And one day, like one day Richard was like really like on edge and really mad at us for not like basically not getting right, not becoming more Christ-like or not following the rules. And then Brian got so mad at us that he picked up a chair and like threw it through a wall, because this guy was big, like he was a big muscular guy.
Okay.
And he threw like a chair to the wall, and Richard got even, this like set Richard's off even more like on us. And like he threw a glass on the ground, and like it shattered. And like I think this day was more like focused on me at this point. And he pointed at me and said, "Go pray in the corner, because I feel like God, like if you don't repent, you're going to be going to hell real soon," basically.
Oh.
And so I got up and I had to walk through this glass that he just threw. And so I was like in the corner praying with like glass in my feet, like bleeding everywhere.
Goodness.
Like it got like that like era of the cult was very common. Like the dread of that time was like very strong, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you're scared to say anything or do anything because you're not sure what kind of mood Richard is going to be in and what kind of response he's going to give. That sounds scary. Yeah.
What actually set him off like a little bit before that was I had like fell in love with this girl at work. And at the time, like I interpreted everything like through like a religious mindset. So in my mind, I thought God was telling me that this girl was my wife,
Mm-hmm.
And so I told Richard this, and it kind of made him like really uncomfortable. And he wouldn't tell me. Like I was asking him to pray about it. And like he was just like, "Oh, just do what God is telling you." But in my mind, in my heart, I was like, God's telling me to pursue this relationship.
Yeah.
And then he's like, he would give me, "Oh, well, God's going to tell you what to do." And then like in my mind, I'm like, God's telling me to pursue this relationship. So I actually go on a date with her.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I get back, like actually that night when we were driving back, I guess like through context of how Richard was acting, like I didn't have a good articulation in my head, but basically I decided not to pursue that relationship with her because of the ministry.
Okay.
And so when I got back after basically dumping this girl, as soon as I walked in, like him seeing me like triggered him. He started like throwing, like they were having like a movie night and they were like watching like this Christian movie. But as soon as I walked in, like all the kids, like, or I say kids, like teenagers, early 20 people were all sitting watching this movie. And he went ballistic. Like he started throwing stuff around his office. He started like screaming at the top of his lungs. He started like crying at one point. And he was like, God, like he was like basically yelling at God, like, why do you keep me around these people or keep on holding me back? Like, and he was like, I'm gonna leave you guys, basically, like I'm gonna leave this ministry. And like he walked out and he walked back in and was like, God told me if I left, he's gonna strike me down.
Like, right. So what caused this overreaction then? He's upset at the sight of you because you came back after your date, or because you didn't bring your date back with you, or what? Why is he upset?
He was upset basically because I pursued this relationship.
Right.
Like, with the girl.
Okay. So he got upset at seeing you come back from going on the date.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So it sounds like he's absolutely terrified of anybody actually leaving him.
Yeah. And I also think, honestly, like he would tell us he was bisexual, but I kind of felt like he was more gay than bisexual.
I did wonder this when you said that he surrounded himself mostly with boys, but then he went on to marry your sister, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah, so like that relationship was just not okay. Like she, what's crazy is like she confided in my mom that Richard wouldn't sleep with her, and then when he found out he said that, he went ballistic on her, essentially saying like, "Oh, like how dare you say this? Like you're gonna be going to hell."
I suppose he probably feels like his masculinity was threatened at that point when he realizes that his wife is talking about their sex life to other people.
Yeah, like honestly, he just didn't really, I think in his mind, like he was reformed, like God made him not gay anymore. But in reality, like I don't know what kind of mental blocks were there, but he obviously was like more into dudes.
Right.
But
so did he have an outspoken attitude around the LGBT community, or was that not something that was really discussed within the group?
So like he basically was like, as an ex-bisexual, like God can change anybody. So like he didn't preach hatred towards like the LGBT, but he basically like was like, they can be changed. Like, I guess that is kind of hatred. I really don't know how to, but
yeah,
like, in our minds,
ex-bisexual is not a a person I've ever met before. I've never met an ex-bisexual person before.
Yeah, like basically, because like Christians, they teach it as sin, right? So like basically, like we were taught to be like compassionate towards like homosexuals, but like in a weird twisted way, like, oh, God can heal you from your wickedness.
Yeah.
But all while like him maintaining, because I found out later that he actually had molested one of the other boys there.
Oh my goodness.
After I had left. So he's definitely a very compartmentalized individual.
That sounds terrible. So he would
I would say this, like his methods for praying over us were really weird. Like he would lay down with us, and cuddle us. It's so hard to say. Like he would he would say, oh, this is like the Father's love. Like we're doing this because the world has made it evil and like sexual to do this, but we're going to do this because it's brotherly and godly.
Right. And it's interesting that he felt the need to voice those things.
Well, it's just weird, like this grown man, like praying and cuddling these these young or, teenagers. Oh my God. Like this one, I'm not going to name him, but this one guy, like ladies were attracted. Like he was objectively a really attractive guy, and like ladies just wanted to be with him.
Yeah.
And he, he was struggling because he wanted to like have sex with them, but he was trying to become like, he was trying to be Christian or whatever. So Richard would literally like put his hand on his junk and like pray over it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I'm trying not to laugh because it's messed up, but it's just like the lengths he would go through to like not say that he wasn't gay anymore, but like he obviously was attracted to, like, he would minister to young attractive boys, like young attractive men,
Yeah,
as my wife would say, because I actually met my wife, I actually started working with my wife while I was still in the cult. So she saw me while I was in the cult. When I left,
okay,
we met up again, we got married, but she would say like, man, like he always surrounded himself with like young attractive men, like all the time. So I'm like, from her perspective, it was like quite obvious.
Which leads me to wonder what his intentions were approaching your family in the first place. Was it because he saw you as a potentially somebody that could be easily brought into the fold, or maybe he was attracted to you in some way, and that's why he targeted you and your family?
I think he definitely was. I think it was a mix.
Maybe I honestly think that's also why he got very upset when you came back from your date with somebody else.
Oh, for sure. Because like when we first met him, I had a girlfriend, and like he would always like at the time, like I had become like Christian, so I was like, I'm not gonna have sex with her until I'm married, But he was utterly convinced like that I was having sex with her. Like he was like, he would call me like, God showed me a dream where you guys were having sex. And it's like, no, that didn't happen. Like we haven't been having sex. But he would like tell my mom this stuff too. Like
it's very common that people who preach to their congregants that they have a direct line to God always use God as almost a threat. Like I know where you've been because God told me, or you can't go and do these things because God has told me that if you do these things, this will happen to you. When he threatens to walk away and nobody follows him to try and stop him, and he comes back in and says, God told me if I leave, he'll be really upset with me.
Yeah.
Which is it's the spiritual abuse that must, well, the spiritual trauma that must come from that abuse must be extremely significant if you are somebody who is committed in your faith, and this threat is being thrown at you left, right, and center for small things, major things. I can't imagine the impact that must have on somebody who does feel like they have, their own connection to God and their faith, to then have it thrown in their face as much as you seem to have had it thrown in your face.
I'm like,
A quick word from one of our sponsors. How to See a Man About a Dog by Samuel Knox combines darkly comic short stories, powerful poems, and pulp fiction prose to create a heartbreaking and hilarious journey that readers will not soon forget. This instant cult classic by breakout surrealist author Samuel Knox searches for light in the darkest corners of modern life. Read How to See a Man About a Dog collected writings for a surreal, horrifying, and ultimately illuminating experience. Ebook available on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited. Print copies are available on Amazon, Alibris, and more. Get your copy of How to See a Man About a Dog by Samuel Knox today.
how I justified the trauma really was because like we spent like years reading the Bible. Like when Jesus said, take up your cross, I interpreted it as suffering. So I figured, like I will suffer now and my reward will be in heaven when I die.
Yeah.
So I came very, at the time I was very like zealous. Like I didn't bat an eye when I gave all my money away because Jesus said to live penniless, and how I was treated by Richard, I justify it as like in the Bible when King Saul and David, like Saul was anointed by God, but treated David very poorly. So in my mind, I thought, like I have to forgive Richard every time he does something crazy because he's still God's anointed. Like the way it was taught is like you can be anointed and still have issues. Like you can be called by God and still have issues, and we just have to forgive them, kind of thing,
Yeah.
So it was like this continuous cycle of abuse, like forgiving and being abused, and forgiving and being abused.
And I suppose that maybe you feel like you must justify your suffering somehow. Otherwise, there's that whole other conversation that you need to have with yourself around why you're allowing those things to happen. And those conversations are so difficult that a lot of the time it's easier to try and justify the things that are happening instead of having that conversation.
Right.
And you said that when it comes to what you actually practiced in terms of sort of like Old Testament, New Testament, different, King James Bible, that he was very all over the place with what the group actually believed in. Are there any examples of doctrine or scripture that he would use as like staple things to practice from, or was it just kind of different day by day?
It would change up, but he would always go back to like the book of Malachi, talking about bringing back the children to the Father. He would talk about like basically do my prophet, the scripture that says do my prophets no harm. Essentially, like everything was focused around the fivefold ministry. So like I'm not sure if you know what that is, but in the book of Acts, the fivefold ministry was like apostle, prophet, teacher, evangelist, and like pastor, I think it was. And like these four offices, as they call it, make up like the church. So modern, like regular modern Christianity, they don't believe apostles are around anymore. But this particular branch believes that apostles do exist still, because Apostle Paul was made an apostle after Jesus had already ascended to heaven. So they use that as justification to make like, oh, God can make apostles still. And the qualifying factor is if Jesus meets you personally, then you can become an apostle, because that's what happened to Paul. So when Richard claimed that Jesus came to him, like in a dream, that he was calling him to become an apostle, which is like the highest office. So there's like an apostle and prophet. Like those are the two highest offices in this denomination, which is like the new apostolic. That's why they call it the new apostolic movement, because they believe in apostles.
Okay. And you mentioned another person that was almost like the preacher in the group. So did Richard not do too much preaching himself?
He would, but it was this is where it's different from like, I feel like the other groups, because he would basically talk to us indirectly, like through scripture. Like he would basically like, it was never topical. It was always like a teaching geared towards us and how we're not doing good, and how we're not doing good in the ministry, and how we're holding him back essentially. So oh my God,
did he ever dictate what types of things should be preached about, or did he ever have a say in any of the sessions when you were having sort of like a service?
So it was very much like spiritual, in the sense of like, we would like meditate and pray, and then like whatever scripture would come to our mind, that's what like we would preach about. Like it was almost like improvisation, if that makes sense. Like the other pastor basically was very like, he did all this improvisation, but Richard would focus on any particular thing. He would focus on one topic for months at a time or weeks at a time, based on like dreams or visions he said he had. And like towards the end of like, I would say towards the end of like the saga of like us being like a recovery group, he started preaching more about like the spirit of Jezebel, which was like, Jezebel was like an evil queen in the Bible who like usurped the throne from a king. So he basically like was accusing my mother and my sister of having a Jezebel spirit.
Right.
And it was causing a lot of like problems. And like towards the end, my mother was actually kicked out of the church.
Okay.
My sister actually left like when they actually got divorced. And when that happened, she had already been talking to someone in Minnesota. And so when they got divorced, she like hightailed it to Minnesota to marry this guy. And not long after, my mom was kicked out.
Right, but, which then leaves you with Richard.
Yeah, my brother was kicked out not long after for not like, he was in charge of an eBay store to try to make money, but no one was buying all this old stuff, and so Richard blamed it on him and kicked him out.
Right, which then really does leave you with Richard.
Yeah, I was honestly the last original person besides Brian, the other guy who was a pastor. Like all the other kids were eventually left, or were like left on their own because they kind of started catching on that it was a cult, or like friends and family came to rescue them essentially. And after that period, like it was just that was around like maybe 2014 when my mom was kicked out.
Right. You haven't gone on to university. You've stayed here with Richard and the group. You've moved into the warehouse. You're working at Starbucks to make some money. Most of it's going back to Richard and the group. You're spending your free time going out on like missions to raise more money for the church, taking it back to the group. And you have a little bit of responsibility in the group with sort of some editing and recording. At what point?
Yeah, at one point I was like the big brother too. Like other other men or the other boys would confide in me, and I would pray with them, and we would talk and stuff like that.
Okay. So you have like your place in the group. You have responsibilities in the group. You feel like you're contributing towards the overall mission of the group and
Right.
and your journey within your own faith. And what happens for you to realize this is not typical of a practicing church group, and maybe it's not healthy to stay?
So not long after my sister left, Richard stopped paying the rent for the building, so we moved everything out of there and into Brian's house. We sold what we could and then consolidate everything to Brian's house. And at this point, I actually moved into Brian's house. And I was still, it was actually me, Richard, and Brian all living in his house. But we, at this point, started doing like a house church, but it was only really us for about like a year and a half. And then Richard started going to, like, he started doing mission trips to like Honduras. He had already gone a lot, but he started making it his main focus. And he stopped being around as often. He actually convinced some of his family to buy him a plot of land not too far from where we were at. So he started living on that plot of land away from us while me and Brian were like subsidizing his life, essentially, like working and giving him all of our money. And I would say this was like a long period of me just being alone.
Okay.
Because I was still, at this point, Richard said, I'm trying to remember the exact thing he said. He said, like, essentially, you missed your first chance at your calling, but God's going to give you a second chance. You just have to be faithful and be at Brian's house, like, and pray and try to figure it out. He essentially just left us on our own, really, besides like every Sunday when he would show up and be mad at us for not praying enough. But at this point in my life, I was working at Starbucks and then coming to Brian's house and then just kind of like being by myself. And this is when I started like drifting away from like religion.
Okay.
Because I wasn't as monitored enough, or I wasn't around Richard enough, like the fantasy wasn't like fed.
Okay.
So like, and at this point, like I said, I was a very zealous person, like, because I was a very zealous person because like my life previous, I was very like depressed and suicidal and not confident in myself. So I thought like this was my next journey. So I was really into it because I felt God had given me a purpose.
Yeah.
But at this point I was feeling like a failure again, but it's crazy because I'm trying to find like a good segue into why I left. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow process.
Okay. Yeah.
Like, I actually started a friendship with a girl at work, and we were like at this point I had been like jogging on my free time. Like it was like my first activity. And then we started jogging together after like she asked, I basically at work, I mentioned I was going to a concert, and she was like, hey, can I go to the concert too? So we all went to the concert. And at this point I was like becoming really good friends with her. We started going on like bike rides and jogs. And then I started having feelings for her. But then she like dropped on me that she was actually like in a relationship, like she was a lesbian in a like relationship.
Okay.
But in my mind, like at this point, my like emotional state was already like twisted. So I basically thought I would never have a relationship. So I thought I could kind of have a proxy like relationship where I can just spend time with someone and have conversation. So like that was like after she had told me that, like I was using her as like a scapegoat for me to like not, when I wasn't at church, I felt like I was living a normal life, like going on jogs and runs with this person. Yeah. So my emotional state at that time just like kept on spiraling downwards, and like some drama happened with her and like me. I kind of got a little weird there, of course, as you can imagine.
Right. Yeah.
And then I basically broke my friendship off with her, and at that point I was kind of like listening to secular music. Like I was going back to listen to music I grew up listening to, like metal and like stuff like that.
Okay.
And there's actually one defining moment I can think of was Richard had gone to Honduras for like 2 weeks. And then like me and Brian, we had been like spending those 2 weeks like praying together, like at night,
Yeah.
like doing Bible studies. Like we were actually like kind of getting really back into it. And then when Richard got back, he basically was like pissed at us because he said like he didn't want to be back. He didn't want to be back here. Essentially, he wanted to be in Honduras still. So he was really pissy, and he was blaming us for not like. As soon as he walked in, he was like, "Oh, I can already tell there's evil spirits in this house. Like, you guys haven't been praying enough." But it was like the opposite of what we were doing. Like we weren't just being lazy about. We were actually like praying.
I suppose this is very different as well because it's only been the two of you, so you both know that both of you have done exactly what he is saying you haven't done.
Right.
Which, when the group is slightly bigger, I suppose would be more difficult because you can't be with everybody every minute of the day.
Right. Exactly.
So he comes in and says these things, and you're immediately must be thinking, well, I know that that's not true because we absolutely have done what you're saying we haven't been doing.
Right. Because like at this point I had broken off that friendship and just stopped hanging out with friends again. And after that night, he came back the next day. But before that happened, I got off work and I was walking up to the house and I saw a gecko. This will make more sense. I saw a gecko like in the shade of Brian's car.
Okay.
And I was like, oh, it's just a gecko. And so like a couple hours later, Richard shows up. He had a key to the house too, right? So me and Brian were just in the living room. And he fiercely like opens the door and he's like, I just saw a snake manifest on the driveway. Like a snake appeared out of nowhere. Like that's how he was like sweating and his eyes were jittery. And like, he was like, it almost seemed like a seizure, to be honest with you. Like I looked him in the eyes and it's just like, that's when like something clicked in my mind. Like he's not healthy in the head. Like,
right.
And then Brian ran out with a shovel and like killed this poor gecko. Because like it was essentially like in his mind, like Satan was manifesting snakes around the house because he was being attacked spiritually. But I had seen that gecko hours earlier chilling in the sun.
Yeah.
Or chilling in the shade, trying to get out of the sun. Sorry. So that's when it kind of started clicking in my head. Like I didn't have like a full articulation in my mind just yet, but it's like the wheels started turning. Like maybe he's crazy, you know?
Okay.
So I would say about 2 months after that, I was still a believer in God at this point, but I was like very depressed again. And like, I felt like I was holding Richard back. So like how I spun it to Richard was like, I told him, God, I feel like God's telling me to leave because I'm holding you back. Mm-hmm. And then when I started saying that, Richard started being nice again. He started being like how he was when we first met.
Yeah, you're very much appealing to his ego when you phrase it that way as well, and his narcissism, if he is as narcissistic as he seems to be. When you say, you know, I need to do this for you.
Yeah, well, you know, he was also very paranoid because like every one kid that left, he swore that this kid joined a satanic cult that was out to assassinate him.
Right. Okay.
Like so like I think he got nice because he realized maybe that he didn't have control over me anymore, and that he was trying to ensure that I wasn't going to go out and like do what I'm doing now. Essentially, like, you know, telling the truth. So he was trying to be buddy with me, I feel like. And so I actually moved in with my best friend, like my childhood best friend that I got in contact with.
Okay.
And at this point, like, honestly, like at this point, I wanted to die. Like, I was already convinced, like Richard had convinced me that like, if I left under his spiritual protection, that Satan would come and take me out. And so I was kind of hoping that would happen. Like I was like praying every night, like for forgiveness. So like I could just die and go to heaven and not have to suffer anymore. Like that was my end game, you know, like was to leave and die.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
But like obviously, like I didn't get struck by lightning. I didn't get hit by a car or anything. I just slowly started entering this normal life. And actually, my therapist told me because I moved in with my old best friend, it kind of set my psychology back to like a time that was before the cult.
Okay.
So like
Yeah.
I was able to like latch on to that mindset. And for a while, I kind of suppressed that time, like because at that even at that time, I didn't really believe I was in a cult. I started like listening to documentaries like a year later and realized I was in a cult
Mm-hmm.
like,
Yeah.
after.
Yeah. Were there any parts of podcast episodes or documentaries or things that you would listen to or watch that you thought, wow, those things happened to me?
There was like I can't remember, but there's a lot of like free documentaries on YouTube about cults. And I just started like a lot of similarities were coming up between Richard and these leaders that I started noticing, like the
Right.
control and manipulation and like everything's about me essentially. Like I'm the prophet. Like I'm like no one should be talking right now except me. Like that kind of thing, you know. Like I started slowly realizing that I was in a religious cult. It wasn't like a normal experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned in your emailed to me that since you left the group, you have been given a diagnosis of PTSD.
Yes. Yeah.
So, how did that manifest itself, and how did you begin to work around that diagnosis or work on trying to improve that diagnosis?
So it's kind of an ongoing thing still because even though I know, like, even though I even though I know it was a cult, like emotionally, like the emotional pain is still there from like being in a group and then leaving, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
because before that life, my life wasn't very, very good. And then during that time, you know, it was supposed to be like a hopeful time, but it ended up being like worse.
Yeah.
And then leaving, I kind of felt like I lived the first part of my life like in hell, you know? And to be honest with you, like meeting my wife and having a kid kind of helped me like reset in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And um my PTSD at first got diagnosed when I had an episode at work. Like I just kind of shut down and I couldn't like focus and I was very unresponsive and I had to like leave work. And then I took a medical leave and went to a psychiatrist and that's when he diagnosed me with PTSD.
Okay.
Um, before that, I had gone to therapy, but I wasn't. It was a therapist, so she couldn't like diagnose that. I think,
Okay.
but I tried getting on antidepressants, but they made me more depressed. So I'm currently unmedicated.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess how I deal with it now is I look back. I try to view everything logically and objectively, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I realized that Richard was mentally ill. I realized that my family has had also struggled with mental illness, and I rationalized it that way to understand what it is and to approach it in a different way, if that makes sense.
Mm.
Like honestly, like I don't even like harbor too much hate towards religion because like once I realized that personally for me that God wasn't real, like I how can I be mad at something that's not real? You know, like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
still that's still like thinking in a that's still thinking in a abstract way because if you can love God and you can hate God, those are both abstract concepts. So I figured, you know, that's how I've been able to cope with it is realizing that religions the function of religion is mostly community, you know, like the average person goes to church and they don't really think about the theology or like the deep part of it. They just go there for the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I've been able to rationalize it that way and kind of cope with it, I guess.
And you've obviously had some wonderful support from your partner as well, who
Yes.
you mentioned talking about these things with her, and she would
Oh,
say
yes.
that whenever she saw you, Richard always surrounded himself with kind of young, attractive men.
Right.
So are these conversations that you're able to have with your wife, and she's able to kind of talk through and support you with working through all of these things?
Oh, yes. We actually, the first night we started dating, we actually, like, I opened up to her about it, actually, and like showed her like all the pictures and stuff, and was explaining to her, and she was like, it was all
Wow.
starting to make sense to her. She was like, like, she she thought like I knew you were in something, but I didn't realize it was that bad.
Yeah,
So
that's
like we've been,
amazing that you have that relationship, and that you're supported and able to have those conversations with somebody that you trust, and somebody who loves you unconditionally, and is not saying I only love you as long as you are with me, or as long as you are part of this group, or as long as you are going out
right.
for 8 hours a day selling water bottles to bring money
Right.
back.
Yeah.
So that's fantastic. And I've been trying to make sure that we take a minute to appreciate those people in these episodes that are helping people tell their stories, and kind of just being patient and listening and offering their advice or their insights to what certain experiences may have meant, or why certain things happen. So massive appreciation, shout out to your wife.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and just very important to highlight mental health, how it can be, the different ways in how we can recognize ill mental health, and the different ways that we can start to work through those things to try and manage them in some way as well. So thank you for talking about that with us as well. I know it must be tough to speak about yourself personally in that aspect. So I think that will be helpful to others who are listening, who may have had a similar diagnosis and are working through things themselves as well. And so I've only really got a few questions left on my list before we finish today.
Sure.
I
Sure.
did want to ask what your relationship is like now with your father, who I'm guessing you, once you moved, you didn't have as much of a relationship with, and your mother
Right.
as well, who was kicked out of the group, but you remained in the group. So what does your relationship look like with those two people now?
So I would say we're on I'm on good terms with my mom. I think I'm the only person in the family that went through it that's not religious anymore. Like my mother is still religious. She latched onto another church pretty quick.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
After she got kicked out. My brother, I don't think he goes to church, but he still believes. And my sister, the man she went to Minnesota with, he was in a church up there, so she attends that church over there. So with my father, actually, we actually live in the same apartment complex now, and
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I look out after him. He's over often to help out with the baby, and
Oh, that's great.
so we're repairing our relationship, and I don't think it ever I don't think he ever stopped like caring about me, or like he never felt offended. He felt like he failed, but I had to explain to him, like this is not a normal situation, and the manipulation involved is not like he wouldn't be able to do anything about it even if he tried.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like we've had that conversation already before too. So
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, that you're able to have that conversation with your father. And I'm sure as well he is absolutely loving having the grandfather role after kind
oh
of
yeah,
losing some of his time with you as a father. He now gets to have all that extra special time living so close to his grandchild.
right. Yeah, he definitely loves seeing him, that's for sure.
Oh, lovely. And what about your sister? Do you speak to her?
Sometimes when she comes down back to Texas for holidays, we hang out and have family time. So
Okay, so generally overall, you seem to be in very good stead with all your various family members.
yeah, like it's honestly, it's kind of hard for us to kind of talk about what happened
Yeah.
still amongst ourselves. I've had a conversation with my mother, and she's asked for forgiveness for bringing me through that, but it's still honestly, like, besides my therapist, you're the only other person besides my wife that I've kind of talked extensively about it. So I'm even still trying to process
Mm-hmm.
what happened all these years. Like, I'm even hoping to one day maybe write a book about it. But
Yeah, that is something that I would definitely read. I'm sure there's as you've spoken and as you kept apologizing for, which is something I'm sure you probably do out of habit at this point. But
yeah.
there's so much that happened, and as you were remembering one memory, another memory would come back from a different point in the timeline, and then that would lead you to another memory on a different part of the timeline. So it would be really interesting for you to have this conversation with somebody, write down all of these memories and thoughts as they come back to you as you talk through them all, and then put them in chronological order and write about them in detail. It would be absolutely amazing to read what you could put together with that, because I'm sure there's so much that we haven't spoken about today that you've forgotten to mention, and you'll probably go away and be like, oh, all those things I was going to talk about but forgot to
Yeah.
say.
It's already going through my head right now, to be honest.
I always say I could speak for hours with people who have these stories, but there's just never enough time.
I'm just hoping, like, I was able to convey something unique or educational through my experience, because, like, it was very much a cult of personality type situation revolving around one person, and like our beliefs were kind of mixed, but it really was a larger part of like the Dominion movement here in the United States.
Yeah.
Which, like, I don't want to get too political, but it's like which is a big point of contention right now with politics in America, like particularly like in Texas, with the Texas governor like being a part of the Dominion movement kind of thing. So
yeah,
like,
it's very strange as a woman to read the types of laws that are being passed over in Texas at the moment, and how oppressed women must feel in those parts of America. I imagine it's very difficult for women to feel like they have autonomy over themselves at the moment with the anti-abortion movement over in that part of Texas. So I don't know if that's kind of what you meant by politically, that those are the heavy parts of the doctrine that are coming through.
And that's like honestly like that, but like there's a more nefarious movement with like the 7 mountains of what they call the 7 mountains of influence or culture.
Okay.
So essentially, like, their main goal is to take over like the 7 pillars of society, and it's almost like people have kind of compared it to like the Taliban taking over, Afghanistan, like a religious government.
Yes, I kind of see it, but in my mind, I'm linking it more to something like The Handmaid's Tale, which does use the Bible.
Right.
And it feels like there's this small group of people who are basically saying that they are going to take over a certain amount of space and rule it as strictly Christian under their rule, which is terrifying.
Right. Well, they think that if they're able to do this, that Jesus will return. Like, they think if Christians take over the 7 pillars, then that's when Jesus will return. But
yeah, that's very scary. I'm sure it's kind of I'm sure women in that part of America feel uneasy at the moment, and it must be hard for women who have husbands who agree with the bills being passed over there, because even even if I I support my partner in everything that he does. But if
Right.
he came home one day and said that that's what he believed in, that's what he supported, that is not, I don't think it's hard. It's really hard. Until anything like that ever happened, it's hard for me to sit here and say, I'd never stand by him if that's what he came home and said he supported. Because a lot of religion comes, well, a lot of the practices in Western society, well, I suppose in a lot of very misogynistic religious practices around the world, is that women must obey men, women must obey their husbands, women are there to basically do their husband's bidding and not question their husband, and then if their husband comes home and says, yes, I agree with anti-abortion laws, and then the wife must be like, oh, jolly good. I don't know.
Well, the crazy thing, what's interesting, what you're saying about that is, like this particular movement, like women have, it's not like traditional where it's like women sit down and they don't speak. Like there's a lot of women leaders in the Dominion movement. Like
yeah, that
they call
scares me
themselves
as
prophets and
well.
apostles. Yeah. So like it's it's something new and weird and
Scary.
like I don't think the public quite understands like this new form yet, because there's a lot of weird spiritual beliefs like there's even like parts that believe in the book of Enoch, like that talk
Right.
about like giants and the Nephilim are going to return, like these giant beings are going to return to earth, like really weird and bizarre things like that.
Yeah, it does sound very strange, and not something that I've come across myself in kind of reading articles and doing various research. But
Oh,
just to kind of move away from the more political stuff and
right.
to bring it back to you and your story, I was actually, before we sat down to chat today, I knew that the name Elijah had its own biblical connotations,
Right.
and I looked it up, and Google told me that Elijah is a Hebrew phrase which means Jehovah is my God,
Right.
and that comes from the Old Testament.
Yes. Yeah.
So were you named Elijah for a reason?
So like I said, my dad was Catholic, right? When I was being born, it was a difficult birth. So like I had the umbilical cord wrapped around my head.
Wow.
I was dying. My mom was dying.
Oh my goodness.
The doctor suggested that I be aborted or else my mom would die. But my mom basically said, no, like, don't do that. Like, I'd rather die. And my father began to pray and open up the Bible. And the first name he saw was Elijah. And that's what he named me.
Oh, okay.
So like from the onset, that story was, when I told Richard that story, he definitely used that to like say, like, see, God has had a call in your life since the beginning, like,
yeah.
But yeah, that's where I get my name from. My father named me that.
Yeah, I just thought it would be an interesting kind of side question because of the stuff around the Bible we've spoken about today, and the name Elijah itself being a name that is in the Bible.
Right.
So just before we finish today, before I ask you if you think there's anything we've missed, I'm wondering if you have any advice for people who may be in similar situations, either with a diagnosis of PTSD or people who have been in a cult of personality and are wondering where they go next and their best course of action.
Well, I would imagine that if someone is in that situation, they probably won't be able to listen to this. But if they do come across this, I would have to say, like, get out, like, I know that's like not really good. Hold on, let me think better. Like, you have to think about yourself and your loved ones and your family. Like, is the trauma really worth it? Are these leaders that are supposed to be your protectors, are they really protecting you, or are they using you? like, and for like the people who have escaped with PTSD, I guess the best thing I can say is, like trauma, don't let the trauma become who you are. Like, like PTSD, I haven't, like, when I was diagnosed with it, I didn't make that like who I was. I used it as a tool to understand like what was happening to me. Like if I were to have a trauma response moment, I use that diagnosis to recognize in the moment and stop myself. Like,
right.
All right, I need to calm down. This is just an episode. Like, I can get through this. And then I'm able to push past the anxiety and depression. And, like, don't let the diagnosis become who you are. Use it as a tool, essentially, to help you get better.
I think that's a very nice piece of advice for people to not become defined by their diagnosis or to allow their diagnosis to define them. I think that's very important for people to hear. So thank you for sharing that with us. And
sure.
One last question I did have. Where is Richard now? Do you know what he's up to? Where is he? What happened after you left? Is the group still going?
So it's not it's not a church group anymore. Richard runs his own ministry.
Okay.
Well, he puts on like daily videos, like he puts out videos. He travels to Honduras. Actually, he linked up with a group in Australia and toured with this other apostle called Ryan Lestrange for a little bit. And then from there, he formed his own little network, and he goes to Honduras, and he has an online school called School of the Eagles, where like, I really don't know what's going on in there because it's like private groups. But I guess he puts on teachings. I'm sure he's just, leeching money from them.
Right.
Brian is still with him. Brian's like a teacher on the program.
Okay.
But he's still doing his thing, really. And he doesn't have a massive following. He has like maybe 3,000 people following him, but it's mostly people from like the Philippines and Honduras that are following him.
So he's still preaching in some respects.
Right. Not good.
Worrying. Yeah. It makes you wonder how many other people have stories similar to yours, since Richard has carried on doing what he said you were holding him back from. What he said he couldn't do properly because everyone was holding him back, and even though Brian's the only person still with him from the original group, he's still carried on doing those things.
I think he realized he does better like virtually and like in conferences than he does like with people, because I think he's able to put on a show better with strangers than people he lives with.
Well, I suppose strangers, like if I tuned in to watch him now, I probably wouldn't see him behave in the way that he did when you came back from that date.
Right, exactly.
So and I just wonder what poor Brian is subjected to, still being with him. The wrath of Richard, if something doesn't work out for him, I'm sure is probably Brian's fault.
I honestly feel sorry for him. Like he's not like 100% there,
Yes, I wonder if anyone listening will have similar people from their lives that they have compared him to, and I'd be interested to know who those people are. So if anybody does have similar experiences or stories, then get in touch and let us know, because I would be really interested in hearing them. So unless you think there's anything we've missed today, Elijah, I think we've gone through everything and pretty much covered the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, because there is a lot to the story, but like I don't want to like go on like you said, we can go on for hours. Maybe one day, if I'm able to articulate myself in a video, maybe we could come back and talk about it one day.
Oh, I'd love that. Yes, yeah, definitely.
But it's definitely like it is tied to the New Dominion movement. But my particular experience, it was very we were our own little ragtag group in Humble, Texas, like a weird cult group in Humble, Texas. But
that's a nice deep sigh as you come to the end of telling me your story, when you mentioned before that you haven't spoken about it to many other people. So a nice kind of, yes, we got to the end of it. So I always just round up by saying that I guess all there is left for me to say is just a massive thank you for coming and sharing your story, for trusting me and the listeners to take your experiences on board, and hopefully what you've come here and told us today can help one or two people who are tuning in to work through their own experiences, their own trauma, to maybe other listeners who come across these types of charismatic people and realize that there are red flags, because they've been able to hear firsthand experiences of people such as yourself who have been in contact with these charismatic people. So Thank you so much, Elijah, for coming and sharing your story today, and
thank you,
and for putting it out there for people to listen to.
Right. I guess one last thing I want to say is I know you mentioned like the apologizing thing, but I really do want to. I know I'm very like scatterbrained right now, and I'm hoping one day I could actually articulate the complexities of the situation better for you guys' education on this subject. So
I honestly think that we've covered a lot more than you realize, and if you do ever decide to listen back to the episode, which I know a lot of the guests don't want to do because they don't like to hear themselves, but if you do ever decide to listen back to it, I think you'll realize that we've covered more than you think right now.
Right. Okay.
I always think, I was going to ask that question, and I listened back to the episode, I did ask that question. We just packed so much into such a short amount of time that a lot of the smaller stuff that we discuss, I think we forget off the top of our heads. But yeah, I think this has been a fantastic interview, and I really do think that it's going to have impact on people that listen to it. So thank you so much, Elijah.
Thank you for having me. I'm hoping in the future I'm able to make my own content or come back on here and just express and tell more of my story.
Absolutely. And if you ever do decide to launch your own platform, whether it's a blog or a YouTube channel or a podcast or a Twitter or anything like that, then I will be sure to let the listeners know where they can find that content, so that they can go and follow you and have a little read and a listen of your experiences and your story. So thank you so much, Elijah. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
I hope you do too. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. Thank you for tuning in. You can contact me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been the Cult Vault.